For years, the U.S.-Mexico border has been described as a line of law and enforcement, a point of control, but in truth, it has long been something far more fragile, a contested frontier between state authority and organized criminal power. The recent revelation that a cartel-linked figure allegedly placed a $50,000 bounty on the life of Chief Border Patrol agent Greg Bovino is a watershed moment. It marks a shift from criminal networks merely evading state control to actively challenging it. This was not an idle threat. It was a calculated assassination plot orchestrated through digital channels meant to send a message to every federal agent on that line. The state is vulnerable, and those who defend it are targets. I have studied enough conflict zones to know what this means. When organized crime becomes confident enough to threaten senior officials, it no longer functions as a fringe network. It operates as a parallel power structure, coherent, strategic, and deeply entrenched. Cartels today resemble paramilitary actors more than gangs. They have hierarchies, logistical chains, and transnational funding. They don't just traffic drugs or people, they trade in fear. And fear is their most effective weapon because it corrodes the very trust upon which state authority depends. What is unfolding at the border is no longer just about migration or narcotics. It is a deeper, quieter war over legitimacy. The cartel's strategy is as much psychological as it is physical. By targeting law enforcement leadership, they aim to shake morale, create hesitation, and fracture the thin line that holds an already strained border system together. And when the line itself begins to fracture, the state's ability to enforce its own laws begins to erode. This is why this moment matters. An assassination plot on a federal officer is not simply an isolated criminal act. It is a symbolic assault on the sovereignty of the United States itself. And if such assaults are allowed to multiply without structural response, they do not just weaken a border, they weaken the republic behind it. I have spent years studying the anatomy of organized crime, and what I see unfolding at America's southern border is not the chaos of a street gang, it is the architecture of a parallel state. The cartels operate with a level of coordination, discipline, and strategic calculation that often mirrors the very governments they undermine. Their command structures are layered, their financing diversified, their logistics transnational. They do not simply smuggle drugs. They move commodities, enforce hierarchies, and maintain territory. They wage war in silence until they need to send a message. And the assassination plot against a senior Border Patrol agent was precisely that kind of message. This architecture has grown over the decades. U.S. demand for narcotics created the market. Corruption, both in Mexico and the United States, created the cracks through which it spread. And over time, cartels learned what many insurgent groups have learned before them, that power is not merely taken with guns. It is sustained through fear, networks, and money. They control border corridors with precision, knowing which routes are patrolled. which officials are vulnerable and which communities can be coerced. Their ability to place a bounty on a high-ranking U.S. official without fear of immediate annihilation speaks to the scale of that power. This is why treating cartels as mere criminal enterprises misses the reality. They behave like paramilitary actors. They intimidate governments, infiltrate institutions, and cultivate transnational alliances that make enforcement a perpetual game of catch-up. And the longer this architecture is allowed to entrench itself, the harder it is to dislodge. This is not just about border security. It is about the slow erosion of the state's monopoly on force, a principle without which sovereignty becomes a hollow word. History shows us that once such structures reach a critical mass, the state faces a fateful choice: either confront them with strategy and conscience or watch its authority bleed out slowly at the edges. America is approaching that threshold. The architecture of criminal power is no longer in the shadows. It is standing at the line, looking the state in the eye. Borders have always been more than lines on a map. They are pressure points where the power of the state is most exposed. In the daylight, governments speak of walls, fences, and patrols, but in the shadows, another war is fought, an unending struggle between the state's authority and those who would challenge it for profit. The assassination plot against Chief Border Patrol agent Greg Bovino is not just an isolated act of criminality. It is part of a shadow war that has been intensifying for years, where cartels no longer simply evade U.S. power, they confront it directly. Cartel organizations understand the terrain better than most nation states. They map enforcement schedules, explore legal gaps, and coordinate movements with military-like precision. But when pressure on their smuggling routes increases, when seizures rise, when operations tighten, they respond not with retreat, but escalation. Violence against border agents has grown more lethal. Cartel gunmen, operating through networks on both sides of the border, now deploy targeted intimidation and organized assault to undermine enforcement. This is how shadow wars work, not in open declarations, but through constant, calculated pressure on the weak points of state power. I have studied conflicts like this in Central America, in Southeast Asia, and in the Balkans. The pattern is always the same. When non-state actors begin to treat the state's security forces as legitimate military targets, the boundary between law enforcement and low-intensity conflict begins to blur. A republic may tell itself it is not at war, but the forces arrayed against it behave otherwise. The U.S.-Mexico border has quietly become such a space, a battlefield without a declaration. The danger is not only physical, but psychological. When officers live under the shadow of assassination plots, when their families face threats, when their presence itself becomes a provocation, the line between law enforcement and combat begins to erode. And when that happens, the border is no longer just defended. It is contested inch by inch. In a war, most of the nation never sees. History has shown time and again that frontiers are the places where states reveal their true strength or their deep fragility. They are the edges where sovereignty is tested not by speeches and capitals, but by the ability to enforce law where the state meets resistance. The assassination plot against a senior U.S. Border Patrol official is a stark reminder that America's border is no longer a passive line. It has become an active battleground between state authority and a transnational criminal system. And this is not the first time a great power has faced such a test. In the early 20th century, the United States itself confronted violent smuggling empires during Prohibition. Those criminal networks used bribery, targeted killings, and territorial control to undermine state enforcement. Further back in colonial frontiers around the world, empires often found themselves struggling to assert power against armed actors who controlled trade routes and loyalties on the ground. The pattern is always the same when the state cannot fully control its frontier. Parallel powers rise to fill the void. But perhaps the most sobering parallels come from modern Latin America itself. In countries like Colombia in the late 20th century, drug cartels operated with the sophistication of small states issuing threats, buying politicians, killing judges, and capturing parts of the security apparatus. At first, governments dismissed their power as criminality. By the time they recognized its political implications, the cartels were already deeply embedded. The lesson of these frontiers is clear when organized violence is met only with reaction. The state falls into a cycle it cannot win. Borders become permanent battlefields. And criminal actors evolve faster than the institutions meant to stop them. If the U.S. continues to treat cartel violence as a policing problem rather than a challenge to sovereignty itself, it risks repeating the very mistakes that fractured other nations throughout history. Societies under pressure have often turned to the language of war, not as a description of reality, but as a way of rallying power, shaping perception, and suspending doubt. Today, as cartel violence grows bolder and the border hardens, the American political conversation is increasingly drenched in war rhetoric. Politicians speak of annihilating the cartels, of crushing them to their knees, of taking the fight across the border. This language may sound decisive, but beneath its surface lies a dangerous paradox. It simplifies a complex transnational security crisis into a battlefield narrative that leaves little room for strategy and even less for conscience. The power of war rhetoric is that it creates urgency. It turns the border into a symbol of siege and frames every action as a defensive necessity, but it also narrows the political imagination. When we speak of war, compromise becomes betrayal. Diplomacy becomes weakness. And structural reform becomes an afterthought. I have watched this pattern unfold in other contexts: the war on drugs in Colombia, the war on terror in the Middle East. Each began with righteous anger and ended with entrenched conflict. War rhetoric promises clarity. In practice, it delivers escalation without end. cartel violence is real and lethal. Bounties on law enforcement officials, assaults on federal facilities, and coordinated operations are not abstractions. They are direct challenges to state authority. But rhetoric alone cannot secure a border. Declaring war on networks that thrive in the shadows can actually strengthen them, granting them the political stature they crave. When governments mirror the absolutism of their adversaries, they risk becoming what they claim to fight, actors driven not by justice, but by force. The border is not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It is a complex ecosystem where law, economics, politics, and humanity intersect. If the United States responds only with the language of war, it will blind itself to the structural and moral dimensions of the crisis. The danger is not just losing control of the frontier, but losing sight of what kind of nation the republic becomes in the process. Behind the headlines, the press conferences, and the political slogans, there is a quieter and far more enduring story, the human toll of a border under siege. When cartels place bounties on federal agents, when threats become credible enough to alter security protocols, when violence spills across the line, the consequences are not contained within press releases. They are lived by real people. Law enforcement officers and their families live under constant threat. Migrants are caught in the crossfire. Border communities live in fear, and entire regions learn to breathe in an atmosphere of unease. I have met many public servants around the world who know what it means to serve under threat. Border agents and officers in the United States are now entering that same reality. They are not only confronting traffickers and smugglers, they are confronting organized violence designed to break their resolve. They must change their routines, shield their families, and learn to live in a state of heightened alert that never truly recedes. This is the cost of a war that has not been declared but is being waged nonetheless. But theirs is not the only burden. Migrants, too, are paying the price of this escalating conflict. Desperate people fleeing poverty, violence, and instability are forced to navigate a landscape dominated by cartels that treat human lives as currency. They are extorted, coerced, and often discarded. Communities along the border, American and Mexican alike, live with the sense that their lives are no longer their own, shaped instead by forces far larger and more ruthless than they can control. This is why rhetoric alone is so dangerous. It turns complex human suffering into a backdrop for political theater. Real security is not built on slogans. It is built on the recognition that every assassination plot, every raid, every smuggling operation leaves ripples through families and communities that last long after the headlines fade. If a republic forgets the human beings behind its border policies, it loses more than security, it loses its soul. Every great republic faces defining moments when its power is tested not only by external threats, but by forces that chip away at its authority from the shadows. The border crisis now unfolding is one such moment. A cartel's decision to place a bounty on a senior U.S. border official is not just an act of criminal defiance. It is a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the state, and how a nation responds to such a challenge determines whether it preserves its character or loses it in the pursuit of power. The temptation in moments like this is to respond with overwhelming force, to meet brutality with brutality, fear with fear. But history teaches us that states that fight shadows with only hammers often end up smashing their own foundations. A border secured by violence alone may repel enemies in the short term, but breeds new dangers over time. If the Republic abandons its commitment to conscience and due process, it risks becoming the mirror image of the forces it seeks to defeat. This is the true crossroads. One path leads to escalation without end, a militarized frontier where fear governs and the state's moral authority is quietly eroded. The other path is harder to confront, organized violence with strategic clarity, strong institutions, and the unwavering principle that law must remain stronger than vengeance. It requires investment not just in patrols and walls, but in intelligence, cooperation, diplomacy, and a deeper reckoning with the economic and political forces that allow criminal networks to thrive. A republic does not fall overnight. It falls through small surrenders of principle, often justified by the language of urgency. If America is to confront cartel power without losing itself, it must remember that strength is not measured only in force, but in the wisdom to wield it justly at the border. As in history, power without conscience is not victory. It is decay, and what a nation does at its frontier will always define what it becomes at its core.